There we go. There we go. I'm sure it'll be fine. Oh, yeah, good. We have attendees jumping in already. I guess I'll get my disclaimer out of the gate here. Thank you all for joining early. We usually do a 2-minute courtesy for everybody who's coming from meetings, so we'll start at exactly 1:02 on the hour. And then we have great presentation. I'm excited. No metaverse conversation today, but we'll pick that up at another point, I'm sure.
Not yet. We'll build to that.
Yeah, it's exciting. I mean, learning opportunities in particular, as coming from an education background, I think it's going to be so cool for kids to be able to learn using technology in different ways, just to be able to have like, I don't know, like 3D models and building. And I saw one of the things they covered was like doctors being able to practice with like instruments on people in VR and all this other future stuff, haptic feedback on gloves and bodysuits. It's like you've ever seen a Ready Player One. That's just what I think it's heading towards. Hopefully not the dystopian part of it, but we'll see.
Yeah, we'll put a thumbtack in the dystopian part.
Yeah.
If you think of the doctors performing operations, imagine the fidelity to be able to zoom in so that a movement that's like, whatever, so many inches becomes, millimeters on an operation, like that level of fidelity for a remote surgery situation. It's really, really interesting. I'm excited about that. 5G, etc.
Yep, should be interesting. All right, we're at 1:02, so I guess we can get started here. All right, so welcome everybody to our webinar today. This is a part 3 of a series of discussions on digital innovation provided by Expedient Digital and partners. Previous webinar recordings are available on demand, as well as today's, which is accessible via the Zoom registration link immediately after this session ends, although I'm sure it'll take some time for it to process. All of previous webinars can be found on our website, so go and check those out. And we'll be following up with a comprehensive paper covering all of the topics discussed today, along with a lot more after today's session as well. Today's chat will focus on Novo Nordisk's experience in the planning, deployment, and the transitioning phases to a fully integrated and automated digital asset ecosystem using Expedient's XpConnect platform. My name's Dimitri. I'm the sales director here at Expedient Digital, and will mostly be in the background handling the presentation, timekeeping, and any questions that come up, so feel free to send those. And I'm excited to introduce today's speakers, welcoming Peter Chiappano, Associate Director, Emerging Technologies and Digital Strategy from Novo Nordisk, and Matt Ruth, Director of Digital Innovation from Harrison and Star Omnicom Health Group. Welcome to both of you. We also have a technical staff member, Rohit, on back end in case we have any technical questions that come up we need more depth in. And that's it for my introductions. I'll take a back seat. And with that, Matt, I'll let you take over here.
Thank you, Dimitri, and welcome, and thanks to everybody out there participating. We appreciate you all taking the time to join us, and we're going to have a really awesome discussion. So the agenda for today will begin with about 15 minutes of discussion around the planning and deployment for this level of advanced digital asset ecosystem. We're going to have a Q&A after that around planning and deployment. So if you have any questions, there's a Q&A little button toward the bottom of your screen. Feel free to click that and add questions, and we'll add them in, and we'll have a discussion with Peter about that. And then the next session is going to be around the operationalization of it, and then we'll have a Q&A for that too. So, kind of like, divided up into separate sections, so we have a little bit of like division there. So Peter, on the agency side, I see a lot of clients that currently are setting up the infrastructure for this type of solution. So, there's definitely a lot of planning in place. Can you give some background on Novo Nordisk as an organization and a sense of, the problem that you were trying to solve with this, and then specifically around how you're able to, integrate and automate that digital asset ecosystem, starting with the planning and deployment?
Yeah, sure. So hi, everybody. Happy to be here, kind of going through what we've done and what our journey is specific to content. So obviously working within Novo, we service a lot of different customers across not only the patient universe, but also the HCP universe, the payer universe, as well as medical and unmet needs as well. The challenge with that is obviously the content funnel within that. And not only how we're developing that content, but then where it's living, how we're repurposing, and then the development cycle from there. So I know that there's some key facts in front in terms of where we're positioned as an organization. The biggest takeaway from this is that the volume in terms of what we're servicing for our customers, there is an aggregate need for content to be representative within that. So you can go to the next slide, please. So within that is really the challenge that we had, and I think most companies have, and I think outside of pharma, right, is the content development cycle. One, who's owning it, where it's living, and then how is it being positioned across within the different teams. So if you're looking at the build aspect of that first within a CMS, obviously the authoring that takes place within there. But even before that, and you had referenced the agency side of it, it really begins in the onset, right, of not only the strategy itself, but then how are those tactics going to be conveyed within which digital tactic? Because we know digital is digital until it's not digitally resonating within the right audience and the right conduit for engagement, right? So there is certainly a nuance and a science behind taking that strategy and taking the creative and then implementing it within tactics so that they can resonate within the primary channels that we're looking at, specific to digital in this instance, right? We're talking about email, we're talking about web, we're talking about social, we're talking about field-based tools. So the challenge with that becomes that flow and the channel to move from ideation, strategy, creative, and then the sheer build and implementation within the publishing phase. So that was really on the onset of where the challenge is for this. I think where a lot of people look at content within it, right? How is it being created? How is it being managed? How is it being published? And then how is it being repurposed? And oh, by the way, factoring in the rigor of a very stringent regulatory process tied to that, as well as cost containment for not only agencies, but then also repurposing and distribution, not only within first party, but third party as well, right? So I think when we started this journey 3 years ago, that was the biggest aspect of it, right? We tied it to 3 pillars. Can you go to the next slide, please? So we tied it to 3 pillars, but those 3 pillars were really tied across within these 6 key challenges that we had within it, right? How do we improve the content velocity, or how are we streamlining the build itself? The cost aspect of that, not only for build, but also long-term management tied to that, because I think the standard in the world we live in now for everybody, whether you're in pharma or financials or any of those particular areas, is it's do more with less. And that is specific to the development end of it. So how are we being more cost effective? How are we optimizing across tactics? So not only thinking about within individual channels, but holistically across the content cycle. And then obviously, what is that center of truth, and how can we maximize that content for reuse, not only for final distribution, but then also within the medical legal review process as well. Can you move to the next slide, please? So the biggest part of that was to say, how can the technology solve for that? So we were, and even in the onset, going back to probably around 2013 or so, we've always been an Adobe-based shop, right? We went down the road of saying Adobe Experience Manager would be our CMS. That's how we would develop content specific to web. It was fine, it was great, it was adaptive, it allows for a very nimble process within that, but that was only one channel within there. We then had to look at field triggered emails within the Viva application, interactive viz aids for field distribution, as well as home email distribution as well. All of those, for those people who are familiar with that, require a separate level of build to go into each of those for final deployment as they go across. Whether it's HTML, whether you're using a CMS system or an authoring tool, they all required a separate rigor to go into that, and therefore they had to be built separately and then managed separately across within there. So when we went down this journey, we said, this seems really, really inefficient. Is there a technology-based application where we can connect 2 platforms that are behemoths in what they are in the Adobe end of things and the Viva end of things? How can we, for lack of a better term or a really clumsy term, how can we force fit those 2 to work together and be more streamlined within that? And that's where we partnered with the Expedient team to build out what's defined as the XpConnect platform within that. So it is, and I've used the word a couple of times already, very much a journey, especially on the technology end of it, because we did not have a blueprint or someone that we could look to say, well, who's doing this in the marketplace, right? Who is connecting Adobe to Viva? How are those pieces being built out? How are they seamlessly integrated? We didn't have any benchmarks for that. So we were very much, with support of Expedient, building out the process and the technology ad hoc as we develop the need. So, I've used the analogy, and my team's probably really sick of hearing it. We were very much building the ship while we were sailing it. And with that, you identify the challenges on the technology side, right? So we've structured our AEM environment. We've created a series of templates, components, and fragments that are now all interchangeable within the CMS, so that web, Viva-based CLM applications, and home office emails can all be authored within Adobe Experience Manager and then shared across each of those tactics. In doing that, that's where we're using the XpConnect tool as the predication for then piping, and without me going line by line within there, piping the metadata and the aspects of that content across to Viva Promo Mats and the Viva Vault for final distribution, not only within the field-based tools themselves, but then also for management within the MLR process. Can you go to the next slide? So again, this is a really pared down version of what we have in here. What we're not covering is a lot of the nuances of how do we factor in all of the Adobe suite? How do we factor in Google Analytics? How do we factor in metadata tagging? Now we're in the realm of cookie management as well within there. So what we had to really structure, and what we're still structuring, is that integration and framework to say, CMS all lives within one aspect, whether it's in any of those 4 tactics we've talked about, which are outlined on the side there. They all are integrated across within that XpConnect platform and then disseminated within the Viva application. So that was really the predication of the technology that we're using at this point. And it is still, and was at the time, an innovation. I think we are very much first in class in terms of doing that out right now. And that certainly creates the challenges that lead into that. So it was one part need, Matt, in terms of how we were structuring this out. To circle way back to your original question, I will level set to tell everybody that I talk a lot. So to circle back to the original point in here, it was predicated off of need, but we were also very much being future facing to say, we knew that modular content was on the horizon, and how are we going to structure that within a technology application?
All right, great. So I'm going to filter this first question for you because we've had some previous discussions, so I have a little bit of insight. So I know that you eventually aligned on that you're going to start off this program with the IVAs and then rolling into the other tactics. So how did you plan for that phase deployment across all those channels? And then also, secondly, what did you learn during that first IVA phase that then might have applied to like web and email and things like that?
Yep. So that's a great question. So within that, we wanted to start off with one tactic, right? We wanted to say, what's our proof of concept for building that out? We thought that IVA would probably be, and we were, in hindsight, actually wound up being right. We thought that IVA would be the most applicable for that because, one, we were eliminating what that original build was that went into it. So we knew we would inherently be more streamlined within that. For those people who are familiar within Viva, I would say for how it was originally stood up, it was very formulaic in terms of what that build process said. It has great functionality. It has very unique aspects tied to the CRM as well as the CLM. So it is a great application for reps to deliver a tool. The challenge with that is, one, you need partners who are very versed in terms of building out those production assets for final use. You also have a very defined authoring element so that the creative agencies are working so that they're not building out creative that can't be carried across within IVA. So what we did was then identify through a very rigorous audit process, all of the functionality and all of the core base creative that we currently had living in our IVAs, And then we almost reverse engineered that out to say, okay, if we were now going to author this within an AEM application for owning all of the content, how would we build out templates, components, and then the subset experience fragments to parallel across within there? So our use case was actually very complex because we were putting together those first applications to start. So the biggest part that went into that was auditing the content we already had available to us, seeing what functionality was available from AEM at that point, and then building out where the gaps were in terms of what AEM could support in our current state and what it couldn't state. The good thing was that really, I think we were looking at about 80% of what was already available to us was available through Adobe AEM in terms of what their authoring applications are. So the delta we had to then do is customize within those templates from there. But then once we customized that, we created that framework that was completely usable across both platforms.
Great. And you know, this question is obviously there's some agency folks on the line here. So can you give a sense of the level of support or resistance that you got from the agency as far as like shifting maybe to something that's maybe more templatized or maybe more structured in rules? Because I know there's benefits for everybody, and you know, probably get both from both basically.
Yes, so there was and there still is resistance to go into, right? Because it's changing a model within there. Because even though a lot of agencies, I think most present themselves as being digitally sound in terms of they are, our partners that we work with are great. Within it is very much, even if you are familiar with AEM, a very different process because you're authoring for an end tool that in the past wasn't an apples to apples within that. So there had to be a lot of onboarding, a lot of training, and a lot of comfort tied to that. But we also look to engage the agencies as partners within that because we know that this was changing their model in terms of how they were working within that. So one, the first, and you had referenced it, right? The goal of agencies and creative is just that, to be creative, right? So the first discussion is to say, well, if we're templatizing something, that's going to eliminate functionality, that's going to eliminate creativity, that's going to eliminate boxes, or eliminate what our availability is to work outside of the box more appropriately. And the way that we've positioned it in structure is to say, you have a framework of templates and components, yes, to work within. But for the most part, they are so dynamic that you are rarely limited in terms of what you can incorporate in there creatively within there. And what we're actually doing is, if you are an agency supporting a line of business, and you are not only the digital agency, but also the strategy-based agency, you can handle the asset from ideation through full authoring and full deployment. There are no longer any handoffs that needed to take place. So where you'd have the agencies push back to say, well, you know, it's outside of our comfort zone, this is not what we want to do, this may stymie a lot of what we do as an agency, the onset is to say there is a tremendous opportunity for those agencies to position themselves within the digital space to say, well, we're a strategy agency, we're an authoring agency, we're a digital agency, we're a production house too. Well, then you can handle an asset from soup to nuts, where previously in the IVA space for Viva, there, and even to this day, which is still a little shocking to me, there are very limited agencies that work well within the Viva space for in that, and are either Viva certified or are able to do the full production builds. We've now structured it where a digital agency that is comfortable with AEM can now work with the asset through the full development cycle. So that's kind of where we position, and that levels up to cost, right? There's no much handoffs. We don't have to have multiple agencies involved in the process. It can be as basic as one agency involved in there. It could be two, depending on what the brand business model is. Sometimes there's a strategy partner, sometimes there's a digital partner, but we give the opportunity for them to be one. So the challenges that the agencies were seeing onset, and there are a few in particular now that are working with us, they've really been able to increase their scope of work because they don't have to no longer hand off, they no longer have to hand off those assets. They can just own the asset full on through. And in that, they can also own every aspect of the updates and reuse that they want to do too. So they are limited by very little in terms of what they want to own within the process. The level set, I will say within there too, from a business standpoint, and here's where the agency partners on the line right now won't like what I'm saying, and where the business partners will, This does lend itself to economies of scale. Agencies are positioned that the more tactics they're able to build out, the more money they can charge. And obviously at the end of the day, their scopes increase. So for lines of business and brand marketers in there, you are now, through what we're doing, it allows you the opportunity to holistically build out your tactics. So you don't have to design tactics separately. You can design components that are interchangeable within all of your pieces. Therefore, if you have 4 tactics, you can design components that can be used 4 times. So versus an old agency model where you had 4 assets being created separately, now theoretically, if it's done correctly and holistically, you can build 1 asset that is interchangeable across all tactics. So I think that gives opportunity for some and challenges for other when it comes to billables at the end of the day.
Excellent. Very thorough, and I appreciate that. From a very technical mind to another, I definitely appreciate that description. So transitioning into a technical question, and this possibly would be more of a question for Rohit, basically just around the nuance of Expedient's solution. Does Expedient store anything, or are you more of a communication service bus, basically just passing, the information along? Is there anything stored on an Expedient server?
So I can start that question, and then Rohit, you can get super technical, and I'll get away from the true nuance of technical for that. So N and I, we own all of our content, and we store everything through the templates and the components within our AEM DAM, and then the end assets within Viva. So we own every asset that we develop, that our agencies develop for us. So there is no management by any groups outside of our environment. We've created our ecosystem to house everything. Here's where I'll shut up and let Rohit talk about the technical part.
Thanks, Peter. So yes, Peter's right. We don't store anything. The Expedient platform, the XpConnect platform, is really bi-directional integration between the 2 systems. So all the assets and documents are stored either in AEM or in Vault. What XpConnect provides is that connectivity, the bi-directional connectivity between the 2 systems.
Great. So question back to Peter then. What advice would you give to those groups who are considering integrating and automating their digital asset supply chain?
So a couple different things. The technology part of it, and we said jokingly on the line too, when we were reviewing the content too, about being too proprietary when we give out. If anybody can do what we did just from this conversation, they are way better at their job than I ever could possibly be. So there is the technology component behind that. The level set that I would say is that you are looking at a full transition cycle that goes into it. It's not a flip the switch end of it. The technology part of it actually becomes the easier part of it. Change management, adoption, and governance become the biggest part of it, and working with all your different stakeholders. From our end, because we're an omni-channel and we work across a number of different groups, not only marketing and sales, we also support the sales side as well as the market side, but we also support every single brand within Novo Nordisk for that. So you're not only just working on change management for the agency part of it, you're working on individual stakeholders too. So I would say that the biggest pitfall is to assume that it's something that can happen quickly. It's a lot of rigor, a lot of work that goes into it, but put as equal effort into change management, adoption, and governance as you do the technology part of it, because at the end of the day, that's what makes you successful within now. Technology, you can, and it's lousy to say, you can always throw money at a technology conversation. It's not a great discussion, right? But you can fix, you can solution, you can future-proof within that. If you're not positioned so that you're working with stakeholders well, that's where it becomes really challenging, because it is a new process for everybody. And
it sort of goes back to what you said before about building the ship while you're sailing it. And I appreciate that, is that you could plan. This is the whole point of this section, is you could plan all day long, but the reality is that you're going to meet challenges that you could not have predicted, just based on the many levels, the many dimensions of variables and stuff like that are out there. So, I just think that, any level of advice and guidance is probably helpful for anybody else that might be trying something like that. This might be the last question of the section. We'll just see about time, but How did or do you determine that it was all worth the efforts? Was it return on investment, fast time to market, or some other efficiencies that you got along the way?
So we're in the process now of evaluation within there too. So there are some that are lower hanging fruit, right? You can look at the development in an old model and say, well, this asset cost, I'll be arbitrary, right? This asset, an IVA cost $100,000 to do in the previous model. This new model, net new build, cost you $100,000. It's a net zero gain within there. But what you've done is you've also then created all of your assets that can be used across all of your tactics. So essentially you have a 4-to-1 return on any of those assets that were built that may be a net zero for the individual tactic you're looking at. Where the efficiency comes into play really starts to look at your secondary and tertiary updates that took place. I'll use an example without naming a brand or the asset itself. We were in a POA cycle. We had a tactic that was previously built in the COPE model out. It represented our traditional model where regardless of the number of pages that you had to fix in there or update or redo, you had to essentially go back to the beginning. It was a throwaway model and redo it every step of the way. Within this model, the brand stakeholder knew that they only wanted to update 3 pages for POA. So only those 3 pages needed to be updated. So where you were looking at a previous cost of $100,000 to update the IVA, yes, the first build of that IVA, and again, I'm being arbitrary with these numbers. Yes, that first build of the IVA may have cost $100,000. You only had to then update 3 pages at an approximate cost of $3,000 per page. So you're looking at the dollar gain within there, and also speed to market where if you were looking at an IVA that typically takes 25 build dates once it's handed off from the agency to build for IVA, you're looking at a cumulative author and deployment schedule of 2 weeks from beginning to end. So you've saved almost 2 weeks of dev time within that process too. So those are some of the KPIs that we looked at. We're also in a process right now of evaluating, and I think the latest number that we have 46 identified KPI reports that allow us to assess the efficiency and the cost savings tied to this model right now. So what our biggest one is to look at volume in terms of the number of assets built within there, and management long-term, because the goal is that marketers can go into their Rolodex of assets and say, well, I know I previously built X number of assets for this particular brand. I need to update these tactics for this year. Here's my starting point. So it becomes a reuse category within there. It's cost comparison in terms of old models versus new. It's reuse of what goes into that. And then it's ROI when it looks to what we're tying across for the number of tactics that can be built out or reused within multiple iterations versus single builds and throw away and update each time within there. So we're using a lot of KPIs, both operationally and on the brand side, to measure our benchmark and success on that. So the return on the investment part of it becomes the challenge when you're looking at the platform within this too, because it's the technology aspect, right? And we live in a world, and you know, Matt and Dimitri and I were talking about technology and where it's moving first. Where everybody thinks, and I think people on this phone on this call right now are technology focused and they understand the back end. We're really spoiled by the Amazon age, and everybody thinks that that's just the way everything works, and it doesn't. So there is a cost of doing business in terms of maintaining a digital ecosystem, but where you truly see the long-term benefits for that are within cost compression, agency management, and then tactical management of the individual assets long-term.
And you know, just real quick and this may be a question that you've sort of already answered, because as I'm reading it, I'm like, oh, this is basically all the things that you've said in general, but you know, you mentioned the COPE, right? Create once, publish everywhere, and that's just such a powerful and intriguing idea of the future, where we might be able to create these assets that are approved and available, immediately available in all these different channels. Like, you know, really, really fascinating idea. But was that, you know, go back to the beginning, the planning, was that a part of the plan at the beginning to be like, you know, we want to make it so that this little nugget can actually be pushed out to all these different places at the same time?
Yeah, so that was the original goal within there. It's morphed obviously a lot in there, and I think that's a really good question, because the challenge for this is that depending on what platform you're using, and at the time, right, we were I was fully immersed in the Adobe universe. My team was also managing aspects of Viva, but the connectivity between the two, a component means something different in Adobe than it does in Viva, right? Modular content means a million different things to a million different people. The challenge is now understanding that starting point for us and now where the marketplace is going. And I'm sure everybody's attending webinars on modular content. You know, Viva has them, Adobe has them. They're now partnering on what goes into this now. The challenge is too, that when you think about creating something once and publishing everywhere, the biggest challenge is really the legal review of that, because we know when we're submitting a piece down to FDA, every iteration or version of that has to be scrutinized and evaluated differently. So it is not just, well, I can pick up this image that lives in this part of an IVA and implement it right into an email within there too. Theoretically it works, but you're still going to have to review it within that. So I think the concept of COPE was our starting point, but where we are now is truly in the evolved notion of what modular content has to be and the power of the resources, because we know, audiences and targets are getting really personalized. Everybody has to meet them where they are, right? The customer has specific nuances of what they want, what they like, and all content isn't served up the same way. So any legal reviewers we have on the line, you're not going to like hearing this. There's going to be more content that you're going to have to review. The efficiency model within something like this is that you can have pre-approved assets that live within iterations that you can then streamline your approval process that ties to that. So I think your original question being, was COPE the idea? We conceptually thought that was going to be what it was, right? Use one component here, use it here, shift it across, make the tactics really interchangeable. But we realized that the legal component and the modular component is way more complicated than that, and where we needed to move towards with this.
And if there are any legal reviewers listening right now, I want to make sure to remind them that I'm a very close friend, that I would never do anything to make their jobs harder. Personally, me, Matt.
Less the same thing for my end, right? We have the tools in place to make the job easier when it comes to review within it. The problem is, right, and here's where I'll put companies like Adobe and Viva on notice. And they are not really showing a strong business model or writing strong standards for reviewers as to how they can be modularizing content and how they can be bucketing content as they review it across. Because again, and Rohit used a phrase before, bilateral in terms of those pieces. Right now, if you go sit on a webinar for Viva, they're only talking about unilateral movement of assets as it goes across. They're not even conceptualizing what that looks like. And if you try to pin them down on what that is, they'll talk about something that's very specific to whatever their business model is, but not what is going to be more efficient for anybody moving forward. And that's where I think our industry needs to press the technology platforms that we're using and say, there's a need, there's a capability in place at this point. What are we going to do and how are we going to move that forward? Because I think, legal reviewers, like everybody, their job is hard because the volume that they have to look at through the course of the day is monumental. There should be an efficiency play as to how they review that better, quite honestly.
Right. And communication, like everything, is the key to it, right? Like understanding and constant, bidirectional, as you say, communication. So let's transition, right? Let's talk about operationalization of the platform. So how were you able to anticipate and plan for this change? Obviously, no small task, right? How did this change management scenario actually play out when you began to operationalize it and put it into place, planning versus the actual deal?
So we realized that in planning and rollout, the rollout part of it was, and I had kind of touched on this earlier, right? That was the biggest part of this and the biggest challenge of this, the alignment end of it, the communication end of it. And quite honestly, as the key stakeholder in this and the advocate for pushing this out, I took a lot of learnings from this process as to how to do things better with my team and how to do things better when we're socializing this, because I think we made certain assumptions to say, well, the cost savings and the efficiency savings and all of that, how can everybody not just want this, right? How can they just not need it in their universe? And it became very presumptive as we went through the process to say, it wasn't that marketers and agencies didn't want cost savings and didn't want efficiency within that. It is really a robust process for them to take on. So the way that we structure a lot of this, one was in ideation to start, right, we took a lot of our assets and we audited the assets. We made them bulletproof and saying, all right, what is 90%, if we're looking at a website, an IVA, a home office email, and a field triggered email, what is 90% of the functionality or baseline functionality or creative needs that needs to address all of our universe, right? We know there's going to be outliers. We know there's going to be customization that goes in there, but from the starting point, let's build out a framework within our components and templates that try to address most of everything within there so that marketers can say, well, you know, my agencies, I want this functionality, but your framework doesn't support that, right? The old framework supports it. I know it's going to cost me more money when I go across, but I know I don't have an issue with that. So what we did was really audit everything that was in place before we partnered with stakeholders who, one, we had saw within the organization were either early adopters of technology or also really vested in moving their development cycle across within there, right? For just to speak about our obesity team was really a group in our organization, and to credit them, who knew where they were going with their content long-term, and they knew our previous model was non-sustainable. So what we did was partner with marketers and agencies that, though they were hesitant, were willing to take it on. We structured it as a cost share with them as well too. So that was putting some skin in the game with them to say, you know, within the operational sense, we know typically these assets, you fund the cost of those. We'll share what that build cost is within our proof of concept so that you're not taking on all of the risk associated with that, and that we're partnering with you within that sense. So having that true alliance with them across the board worked. Early on, we had discussions, and we talked about it before. We worked with our marketing operations team who owned the Viva platform, as well as our reviewers, to align on a framework that fit within what they were going to review as it came across. What is a standardization? And I use the word standardization, and any creative person in there will roll their eyes because they know theoretically that could lock in what they want to be in terms of their nuances and their creativity. But we did want to look to standardize aspects of that. So we partnered with those groups. We did a lot of socialization up front. We also did a lot of training, a lot of onboarding, and created a lot of playbooks as well as production guidelines for these assets themselves. And here's where I'll also level set and say, we're still revisiting that on a lot of different things, because we can do a broad-based training for how to do this, right? We have agencies who work in AEM on web, but they've never worked in AEM on an email, never worked in AEM for our IVA. So there are still things that are new within there. So we can do an onboarding from there. Until you actually lift up the hood and you're working in there, you're going to have a litany of questions that came across. So we partnered ourselves and worked with our agency, not only XpConnect, but our other technical agency that was supporting us on this, in positioning ourselves so that we were truly consultative in terms of how this was being rolled out within there. And we're still running, and I wouldn't be honest if I said we still run into challenges now where there's functionality that we need to address. There may be some downstream code issues that come up as we go across. We address them as they come across. We level set to say, let's learn from our mistakes and make that better. But we truly structured this as test and learn. But while we're learning, making sure we don't repeat those same mistakes and have total visibility and clarity within that. We also padded our timelines with everything. So when we were going through and we were working with certain stakeholders and identifying their assets to migrate across, there were some that we had really tight development cycles on with them, and they had drop dead dates they needed to hit. We didn't even want to take those on. Not that we wanted to pad our successes within there, but we didn't want to put any of their tactics in jeopardy because they'd be working on a new process. So we really worked with partners who we had a little bit of wiggle room, if not a lot of wiggle room, on creating their assets for there. So that's how we kind of set ourselves up for success within that too. So the short end of a very long explanation that I just gave was, it's about partnership, it's about transparency, it's about putting skin in the game from an operations sense systemically, and it's about really fostering a good level of adoption and training, retraining, and awareness as you go across with it. You can go to the next slide. There we go. And this is just kind of how within each of these buckets, what we previously talked about fits in the framework. But we're seeing, right, this is the technology part of it. We had a lot of pre-work up front in this timeline before we even started socializing out what the technology part of this is. So I think that's the power of this slide, to say the whole premise of the technology and the innovation is actually downstream with where we were. We had to really do a lot of the upfront that went into this, particularly within the test and learn scenarios. You can go to the next slide.
All right, so similar to the question before about the ROI, this question is, what benefits has Novo seen in moving into the integrated and automated platform? Like what, I guess now operationally, like what did you see? Like what's some numbers? What are some things that you've actually seen that you can announce or praise?
So and again, without getting into the specific of the brand itself, we actually, one of our priority brands, all of their tactics are actually on our COPE framework now as part of what went into that, and it supported a launch phase within it. So now all of their assets are actually interchangeable across within there. So we're in the first cycle of that content, right? They're not updating it because it's part of a launch update, but when they're ready to go into 2022 and decide on what tactics they want to do, they've already built it out. All it represents now is single agencies doing authoring rework in there versus building out new tactics within there. So that's one of the successes that we're looking for and tracking into 2022. We've also looked at cost avoidance for non-inline brands that don't have the same level of agency support on there. There are particular tactics that were built out as part of a POA cycle, and they were able, instead of keeping an AOR on staff, they were actually able to use studio agencies, which come in obviously at a lower cost structure because it becomes low complexity work. They were actually able to use the studio agencies to redo their assets for them versus AORs that have a higher cost model within there too. So there's an efficiency play to that, and leverageability. So we've created a framework, particularly within our ISI. So previously, and I know a lot of other pharma marketers feel a challenge when it comes into an ISI update or an indication change that has to take place, you have to update all of your assets to be representative of that. And sometimes they're individual assets that have to then be redone individually each time, even if you're just updating content like your ISI. What we've structured, we created a singular COPE ISI component. So that ISI component gets updated once, and then each individual tactic points to that component, and it was automatically updated across within there. So there's no longer a need to reauthor any of their other tactics with that ISI.
And that's just such a great example of the potential for reusability, because it needs to be a single source of truth, right? Like the ISI is by nature a one type of thing, like there should not be variations on the ISI. That's just basically what it is. So yeah, great example. Yep. This question, I'm gonna add on to it, but because it's a little bit about planning. So I can imagine that implementing a change of the scale for a company like Novo Nordisk was no insignificant task. How did you anticipate and plan for that level of effort? And I think that since we're in the operationalization, you anticipated and you planned for X. What was it? X plus 10, like X 2X? Like what was the actual final, what you anticipated versus actual?
I think it was X plus 10 plus Y plus Z within that, right? Because again, what we had to balance in this process, we're never, and I'll use the ship analogy again, we're a large organization. We don't have the luxury of saying, well, we're going to stop tactic development so that we can implement this process that, yeah, long-term it'll revamp everything, but you got to put a 6-month hold on all of your assets. So what we had to do was, and I had referenced it before, identify tactics that could glide across. And we're still in that migration phase right now. So what we did was we didn't do a hard and fast push for that. We're actually keeping both environments open in AM so that our legacy assets are still live within that. And when they're ready, when the agencies and the brands are ready to actually update those tactics, they move those tactics across to our unified COPE templates within there. So, which again, that's something new. We thought we'd be able to turn off certain environments and certain codes earlier than we did, we realized we had to keep both of them open just to support legacy tactics within there. So there's an operational cost that goes into that, but the benefit of that is we're allowing our marketers to be able to, and their agencies, to not have to take on extra costs to say, well, you got to have to move your website into Cope, or you have to move all of your emails into Cope. We're saying as a new tactic is brought up and a new tactic is ideated, you'll author that within Cope moving forward, and then we can decommission your old asset that lives within there. So that's kind of the balance that we've had going across there. So again, it's really about time and understanding that there is no end mark for this, because as soon as we move everything across, we have to make sure that we're future proofing that the next version, because that's the one thing about the platforms that we live in, right? There's always another version that comes up, whether you're on 6.5 or version 7 or version 92, whatever it is, right? You have to account for what future proofing is within there too. So what we're trying to do is insulate ours, is put as much rigor up front in that, so that when it comes downstream, we're not running into any duplicative builds that need to take place.
No, a very good point. Fragmentation, that's always like the four-letter word, for our industry, for things like this. Here's another question, and this is an interesting one. So curious what Peter thinks about the various small content authoring tools that are popping up versus what you're able to achieve with AEM. Why would anyone leave AEM for an additional tool? Can you advise why one should stay within AEM to achieve omnichannel delivery for Viva?
Yep. So one, it's the integration that's being mapped out. And I kind of railed on Viva before when I was talking about, they are very much working together, both Adobe and Viva, to integrate those universes long-term. So you have the power of both platforms within there. But it really depends on need, right? We have global partners who are using different tools than what we're doing here. We have some alignments across the board what goes into them. But if you're looking at very pared down version of the tactics, then those, to the person's questions, those pared down versions of authoring tools that go in there may suit your needs, which go in there. The benefit that we're experiencing and what we'll see long term is the bolt on of the marketing suite services that you get with those applications, right? They seamlessly tie across with, and we're in exercise this year too of bolting on Adobe Analytics across our ecosystem, but not as a replacement for Google Analytics, actually working in tandem with the two. So that will create that level of benchmark, because if I hear the word machine learning or AI one more time from anybody without a precursor discussion as to the rigor that goes into building that first, I might throw up, because everybody loves to talk about those concepts. It all is predicated off of your content first, right? And where's your content living, and how are you tagging that, and how are you disseminating that within your different tactics from there too? So AEM as a CMS, so we'll go double acronym on that. So AEM as a CMS allows you the opportunity, one, the long-term modular content approach that Viva and Adobe are partnering on, but it also allows you to bolt on those other aspects. And again, it depends on how robust your universe is, right? Are you getting into true omni-channel marketing? Are you getting into, because I think there's the nuance too between MCM still and omni-channel marketing within there. Is there levels of connectivity where your marketing tactics within non-personal have to connect to what your field targets are within that too? You're talking about two platforms in there. Are you then infusing Salesforce in there? We're in an exercise now where we're using a Salesforce platform, and it's actually integrating across with our AEM as well too within their quick flow. So it gives you the integration opportunities. But to that person's question, I think it just depends on where you want to go with it, because simpler sometimes, I don't like reinventing the wheel about anything. And though it sounds like I like to talk a lot, I wish I could talk a lot less about certain things like this. It really just depends on what your needs are within there. So I would say that, but you have to assess what goes into that and what the long-term vision is organizationally within there as to how you want to integrate your platforms long-term.
Yeah, great. And the idea, the concept that we're talking about is sort of agnostic, right? It's not about platform A and platform B. It's just more of like, this is an idea, and this is a progress toward a future solution that's just, it's a reality. It's where it's all going. So
yeah. Well, and it's to your point, exactly, Matt. It's where everything's going, because those huge platforms can't be siloed anymore. They have to work together.
Right, right. So another question for those, this is sort of similar to one of the ones we asked before, but we can think about it more from an operationalization perspective. For those in the audience who are considering integration and automation like this, what advice would you offer them either for getting started or to optimize their efforts?
So within that, I would really start in, if you're take it on a tactic level within there, build out. The tool itself allows you to extend it to everything. Don't try to do everything all at once within there. Really, and I would say that's a pitfall that I did, right? I wanted to, for lack of a better term, conquer the entire universe at once with all the tactics and be super efficient within all of those. And in trying to move those across, you don't know what you don't know. And sometimes there's nuances of platforms like Adobe Campaign or Viva or AEM, or how things are built out, that if you're trying to do everything all at once, you leave yourself short in some areas. So I would say take it on a tactic level, but allow your build the flexibility to address all of those tactics long-term within there too. Do your POVs on the tactic level within there, and then build out a use case for holistically where that content would live. Say you're taking a website, work with your agency to say, if here's our website for brand X, and we know there's 4 tactics that brand X is supported within there. If we're building out creative, where could that creative live long-term across everything? And if you see that 90% of that creative is leverageable across each tactic within there, well, then there's your use case for operationalizing something like this.
Do your partners sort of create like a visual map of this? You know, I imagine that would be a very helpful, you know, diagramming it, right? To show like, this is our blueprint for what we're going to do. Think of like, it's like another form of a deliverable. Is like we have journey maps and we have, you know, personas, we have all these things that we do from a strategic perspective. This content mapping of what we plan to publish, create once, publish everywhere would be helpful too, right?
So we're actually in the exercise of doing that with them, right? Because it's a new way of thinking when you go across. The other challenge is sometimes there's agencies working across different tactics, right? We have a lot of different agencies, even within the same brand, working across, that are different from patient, that are also different from HCP, that are different from email, that are different from Viva-based tools. So I think that we're moving that way now. Into our marketers' credit, they're starting to think holistically like that, with everything from an efficiency standpoint. Again, it's a change in terms of how things are developed. So that is still a work in progress from our end, but I would say directionally that is where we're moving organizationally.
That's great. So we've got time for one more question, which is my question, because I'm selfishly putting my sort of like, where is it all going? You know, because I think it's just a fascinating idea, and it's something that I've seen, you know, for a good couple of years building up to where we are now. Again, clients are putting the infrastructure in place for this, but you know, there's a very practical solution, which is what you're doing right now, and then there's, well, what's 2 years from now, and what's beyond that? Like, what's 6 months from now? Like, there's so many places it could go, and would love to pick your brain for a second about where you think it might be going.
Yeah, so I think from my end, where it's going is not only leverageability within tactics, right? So if you're looking at just the creative and the builds within that too, it's where, and here's where I'll talk out of both sides of my mouth, where you're going within an automated process, right, of being super targeted to your customers within there and needing to customize content within iterations, right? So it's not only going to be modular content long-term within across tactics, it's going to be modular content within subsets of individual tactics, across tactics, and across targets within there. So that's where I think it starts to really become elaborate in terms of how you're building this out and your schema and your architecture for how you're building it. And I would say if that when that comes, we're not even ready for that yet, right? That becomes a lot of rigor that goes into it. But where you circle back to being data driven and insight driven, allowing interchangeability of your content and content being modular within there will allow data to really drive it. I feel like data and insights is the hugest part of everybody's conversation, right? Data, you know, the song of Gunga Din, right? Water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. Well, it's data everywhere, but not a piece to interpret, right, accurately within there. So data is going to really drive how content is not only created on the offset, but how it's quickly versioned and ideated across within there. And I would say because our development cycles are going to be compressed within there, the same way that you look and saying maybe you're updating a piece 4 times a year to address your customer needs, you may need to update that 8 times a year or 12 times a year because you're becoming hyper-focused within your variations of the customer journey and the patient journey as well. So I think content modularization is going to tie to patient journeys and that data for where we're going in the future.
And do you think that sort of parallel opens up the whole personalization and dynamic content, geographic, like, this is someone in the Southeast in the US, they see something different from someone else, like it all, pairs into the same or buckets into the same thing. Okay.
Yeah, I think it becomes iterations off of that. I think that's a great point, right? The nuances of what goes into that and the challenges within that, because everybody's, and let's just take it in patients, right? Everybody's journey and story is not exactly the same. Everything that resonates within them. We have buckets and categories, and marketing. We love our content in pharma marketing. We love it. Everybody's banging down the door for our content. It's so wonderful that everybody needs it. But I think the reality is it has to be really hyper-focused and really personalized to start addressing the needs of patients and prescribers so that it's speaking to the voices versus trying to give them our voice. And I think that's where modular content's going for that.
Excellent. And, we will be following you to see what you do. Very curious to see where it goes in the next, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, et cetera, from there.
Me too.
And, and with that, we are at time. So, I sincerely want to thank you, Peter, for sharing your time and your experiences with this technology, because, obviously it's really fascinating, very cool stuff. How it's being practically implemented. It's great to have like a real world example of it, and you're helping us all proceed with that. So very much thank you for all that. Also thanks to Expedient, who are the sponsors of this. You can find out more about them at expedientdigital.com right there on your screen. Thank you all people who watched and gave questions and participated. That was very, very cool of you to do that. And stay tuned. There'll be more presentations to come that you'll hear about. And just beyond that, everybody here, all the presenters, all the attendees, have a great day and see you soon.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, man. Thanks, Peter. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye, everybody.